There's a battle outside and it's raging. It'll sure shake your windows and rattle your walls. But the times they are changing. Yes, they're changing.
Perhaps the best part of going along with me on this journey in today's episode, along with next week, when we go down to Australia, Sydney to be precise, that's where we're headed this week. We're not going to be able to go sit on Bondi Beach though. That might be the bad news, so don't grab your sunscreen just quite yet. But there's good news too. You'll be able to listen in to a fantastic conversation without leaving the comfort of your chair or your car or wherever it is you listen to this podcast. And even better, the news is that we're going to go down under to have a conversation with Dr. Josie McSkimming. And in fact, there's even more good news headed your way too. I think the best part about the whole experience is you don't have to sit on that plane for that insanely long flight down to Australia. No matter where you are in the world, I think it is the longest flight in the world. But the good news is, as I say, you don't have to sit on a plane for 36 hours or whatever it is. You just sit back and enjoy this week and next week as I bring you these two episodes with Josie McSkimming. Now, you might be wondering, why did I title these two episodes Earning a Black Belt in Cognitive Dissonance? Well, I picked up that phrase from a comment that she made during our conversation. She was talking about how evangelical or fundamentalist Christians are really masters at suppressing or denying the fact that they are living in a state of cognitive dissonance. But the fact is, as we know now, looking at it from the outside in with a little bit of objectivity, having come out of the church, the fact is, yeah, you can suppress your cognitive dissonance. You can have questions and doubt, or you can shove them down. But the truth is, and this is what we're going to get into in this episode today and a bit more next week, emotionally, that's a really, really unhealthy and frankly an inauthentic way to live your life. It will come out. It will manifest itself in some way. It'll be affecting you in terms of your mental health, your own psyche. People are reporting, many Christians who come out of the system, they are reporting that while they were in it, they were beset with anxiety and depression and PTSD and feelings of inadequacy and on and on and on. And so much of it has to do with this practice of suppressing or even denying the fact that you have certain levels of cognitive dissonance. And to be a Christian then, weirdly, in many ways, you have to earn that black belt in cognitive dissonance. And I'm going to let Josie unpack a little bit more about that in this episode today and again next week too. Now, before we get into the conversation, I'll give you a little bit of introduction on Josie as well. She is a clinical social worker, as I say, from Sydney, Australia. She is the author of a book, and it's entitled Leaving Christian Fundamentalism and the Reconstruction of Identity. And we're going to be talking about that a lot more in the second half next week about her book, and specifically this issue of, on the one hand, what does it mean to be a fundamentalist? And how then do you get into this issue of reconstructing, which is something that I've been talking a lot about in the last several months, and something I've learned a lot about, that yes, it's one thing to deconstruct your relationship with the church and your relationship with God, or your views on theology and God, but then what do you do after that? You can leave it, you can walk away, but that's what I love about Josie's work, is that it's all about reconstruction as well, learning how to reconstruct your very identity. How do you do that? And as a social worker, as a therapist, she's been counseling people who have come out of religion, and this is what we talk about in this episode and more next week, as I say. So there's a lot of really great practical content. We're also going to get into her backstory in this episode today, so that's something really to look forward to. And again, this is what I ask pretty much every guest. I'm not trying to box them in, but I'm just fascinated listening to their story. How did they get out of evangelicalism? What impact did it have on them psychologically, emotionally, sexuality, and so forth? And it's amazing. You hear the same sorts of things. Yes, each story is a little bit different. Obviously, she's down there in Australia. We heard last week, the last couple of episodes, from Cindy Wong Brandt from Taiwan. The weeks before that, of course, we had David Hayward, the naked pastor from Canada. And it just shows, again, as I mentioned last week, that the impact of global evangelicalism is just unbelievable. It's rife. It's all pervasive, as David Hayward said. It not only affects us on a cellular personal level, but it's a global movement. It's not just confined, as I said last week, to the American or North American context. We see people from all over the world who have had issues and struggles and problems with evangelicalism. So we're going to hear what it's like down in Sydney, Australia, which surprisingly turns out to be one of the most conservative cities, probably the most conservative one in Australia. So she's right in the middle of all this fundamentalism and helping people not only to deconstruct, but to reconstruct as well. Now, speaking of that too, we will be bringing you at some point here our podcast that we did in Seattle on the 16th of September. Me and Stacey Ray with a live audience. We talked about this very issue of not just deconstruction, but reconstruction as well. Reconstructing after the deconstruction. So those are going to be coming out probably sometime October, November. So look for those episodes from our live podcast that we did in Seattle. Also, after I finish with Dr. Josie McSkimming, I'm going to be bringing you an episode that my sister Valerie and I did this summer when she was visiting me here on the Rock. It's kind of a 1-year update as far as what's changed since we did our episode last year, Surviving a Fundamentalist Upbringing. If you haven't heard that episode yet, that is one of the best ones I think we've ever done. It's on Podbean as well as my own website, preachersforum.com. You can find those episodes archived. So listen to that before the one with my sister Val and I, because you won't understand what we're talking about having not heard that episode from last year. So the good news is, I suppose you've got time to go find that episode and listen to it. If you can't find it, you can send me a DM, send me a message on Twitter. You can follow me at Mindshift2018. And also, I was going to say, for people who want to support this show on Patreon, there's a lot of great bonus content. There will be a bonus pre-recording conversation that I did with Dr. Josie, and there's some other really good ones on there. I've got some with Cindy Wong Brandt, Chris Stroop, David Hayward, as well as some of my own thoughts that I've been posting up. I've done a few of these now, talking about my own journey of deconstruction. I did another one where I talked about some stuff that David Hayward raised in our podcast, some of the points that he brought up that were just fantastic. So what I did was I went back through and I addressed in more detail some of his points, going through it in a systematic way. So these things are helpful resources for you if you are deconstructing or thinking about deconstructing. So all those great resources are available to you on Patreon for supporting this show. Also, I'm releasing every episode about Wednesday of the week, so you'll have early access to the shows as well as the great bonus content on Patreon. So I'm going to bring you now part 1 with Dr. Josie McSkimming. Let's see if we can't figure out why in the world we would say that fundamentalist evangelical Christians would have to earn a black belt in cognitive dissonance. I am super happy to be joined all the way from Sydney, Australia by Dr. Josie McSkimming. Thank you for being on Mindshift Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I am so happy to have you on this show, especially after hearing about the title of your book, which we're going to get into in a little bit, I think. What is the title of your book? We have something for people to look forward to when we get to that point in the show.
Sure. The book is called Leaving Christian Fundamentalism and the Reconstruction of Identity.
Oh, man. I cannot wait to dive into that topic because obviously there's so much that we're going to tease out when we get into that. So you're coming all the way from Sydney, Australia, probably the most beautiful place in the world, would you say? It's got to be.
Oh, well, yeah. If it could just rain here a little bit at the moment, I think we'd all be a bit happier. It's very, very dry, and we have an existential threat of bushfires here.
That's not good. Well, we have plenty of rain here.
Other than that, it is a truly beautiful city. You're right.
Yeah. I've never been there, but I've seen many, many pictures of the beautiful bridge. And as we talked about, my wife's desire is to go down to Bondi Inc. and get a tattoo there from one of their guys. So someday we may end up coming down to see you.
Someday. Interestingly, just to dive in, Sydney really is the heart of evangelicalism in this country.
Yes, it's very conservative, isn't it?
The other cities in Australia are far less fundamentalist and far less dominated by the evangelical right. Lots of reasons for this, probably because Sydney was the original prison sort of settlement. It was the original convict colony, where the kind of the unwanted British convicts were sent to Australia.
It was a penal
Sydney.
colony. Yeah.
And what's interesting is that right from the beginning, Sydney was understood as a place for the totally depraved. And so there were quite a lot of parsons and religious folk who came here to see if they could save the souls of the religiously depraved. It's got a long history.
I was going to say, you literally had a captive audience, quite literally. They were convicts. They were probably never going to come back to Britain, were they? And so what better place to have them that you got a captive audience? Let's save their souls and maybe rehabilitate them. We're talking, 18th, 19th century? This is the time frame.
Yes, the first fleet was here in 1788.
Right, so late 18th century, you go right on into that. I remember a couple of years ago, I was down in Rhodes in Greece on holiday there, and I met an Australian couple who were actually from the Sydney area, and he was mentioning he was big into the Anglican church there, and he said that Sydney is very, very conservative, even still. This is 7 or 8 years ago, but it struck me that what you just said, it tends to be a very kind of, what would you say, even fundamentalist in its conservatism?
Oh, yes, very much so. And, there's been a lot written on this by Australian theologians, and it is very interesting, and it has been very dominated by that kind of fundamentalist and evangelical right. We don't have women ordained as bishops in this city, in the Anglican tradition, the Protestant tradition. We don't have women in leadership. What is taught and what is propagated is the complementarian view of relationships between men and women, men in headship over women, God's sort of perfect design for humanity, gay people, the whole LGBTI community, stigmatized, the only option being a celibate life. So we've got all of that going on within the conservative churches of Sydney.
Well, what's so strange is that here in Great Britain, of course, okay, you're saying that this was a British colony, it was a penal colony, and yet here in Britain, the church has, I guess, in some ways moved on, because I have several friends who are women or in the church in Wales, for example, who are vicars. So even here, they're a little bit more progressive, slightly. I mean, we still have issues of whether or not you can have a gay vicar or a gay bishop. And so that we're still fighting some of those battles, I guess, in the Anglican church. Is it sort of like Australia because they're so isolated in that way that there's still sort of a pocket of conservatism?
Well, I mean, it's the only city because the other cities are quite different.
Right, and they're so far away.
I think there's probably historical reasons, and I think that there were various strategic moves made by various conservative leaders in the late 1970s that kind of shored up control of the church. I think that there were certain individuals who were involved in putting in key positions those who would maintain the conservatism. And there was a very popular scheme which was developed at universities known as a ministry training scheme, where you would kind of recruit impressionable university students, of which I was one, and school them in all this discipleship and particular discourses and theological discourse, of the conservative variety, and basically plant them in various locations so that you could replicate and maintain the control of the diocese. And that's been very successful. That was very strategic by certain people.
Very strategic thing. What is your backstory? Because you were saying earlier you weren't raised in evangelicalism. At what point did you come into it? Was it in university or did you get sort of recruited into it before then?
In fact, my father is of the Jewish background.
Right.
And my mother is kind of Methodist. They were kind of high church Anglicans, if you know what I mean, with this private faith and, rather irregular attendance, but certainly not with the fervour of evangelicalism. And I went off to one of those Christian camps that kids go to when I was about 10, and I was so caught up in the love and the connections and the attention that was given to me at this Christian camp, and so kind of persuaded by the energy of the message, make Jesus Lord of your life. I was a very serious and a very determined little girl, and so I thought, well, I better do that, which I then did. Once you've done that people then kind of maintain you in the fold, sending you material, sending you the old Scripture Union notes to read. I became involved in, the little Christian group at school. I started my own kind of quest to be an evangelist. I found Christian friends. So all of this happened during my school life, much to the consternation, really, of my parents.
So they were actually a bit concerned that you were all this evangelistic fervor and...
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And of course, you believe that you have only the Word of God and you're concerned for people's eternal destination. And so there's this, compulsion to speak and keep on speaking till you become an absolute pain.
It's true.
But of course, once I went to university and I encountered what I was mentioning before in terms of the quite organised and orchestrated Bible groups on the campus I attended, I became very involved in that. I was trained, I did discipling, I even made videos showing people how to evangelize.
So you
much to my
people.
horror now, but
you're cringing now.
Acted them out, all different ways of promoting the apologetics of the Bible as understood by this group that I was a part of. And of course that translated into church attendance at churches that had a message congruent with this. And I think what was important for me and what I think is very interesting is that I always kind of had a double life. And this sort of certainly has come out in my research and in my book, that even though I really was immersed in this and propagating the message, there were always parts of me that were kind of subversive and kept apart. I'm not quite sure I've ever really believed that men are the head of women. I struggled enormously with this issue about being gay and needing to be a part of some kind of ex-gay program so you could become straight or reoriented.
Yes, so conversion therapy.
I think that there was a kind of a subterranean or another story about who I was, and many, many episodes, probably over about 20 years, eventually led to fortification of this other life till it just became the preferred me, the identity that I wanted to be embracing, not this other one.
So basically what you're describing is the classic cognitive dissonance in a way, isn't it? This idea that you've got this bifurcation, these two sort of people, and I can identify with some of what you're saying, those doubts and those questions and concerns, and you can only suppress them for so long, but of course a lot of people do. And they double down, they dig in, they go in even harder to defend Christianity, to shut down that cognitive dissonance. And yet it's going to manifest itself in some way, isn't it? You can't just suppress these issues. It's going to come out.
Christians are absolutely got a black belt in this cognitive dissonance.
Yes.
It's just astounding how they manage to somehow set it aside and with explanations about God is bigger than us and we can't understand God, these sort of endless circular arguments, which ultimately one uncovers as being quite spurious. And yes, and I think life events happen within the church. There is the cognitive dissonance in terms of the teaching and the lack of fit that it ultimately has. But I think that what happens is various incidents happen too. And a lot of those incidents, to my way of thinking and in my life, were to do with controlling people's very sense of who they can be, controlling women, telling women what to do, silencing and stifling people who were different. I just could kind of start to unmask all these controlling practices that, I was subject to, but I also, sadly, had been perpetuating. It was a huge thing for me. My sister died in 2008, and I was very close to my sister. My sister was gay and a very well-known poet in Australia by the name of Dorothy Porter. She may not be so well-known in the UK or in the US, but a very, very well-known poet and writer in this country. And I think her death was just the absolute end to me of all of those notions of heaven and hell and punishment and who's in and who's out and this, emotional and mental gymnastics we all put ourselves through, it just died.
That was the final
Everything
straw.
died, all those ideas with her.
So was that the final straw of your deconstruction process, as it were, or your coming out of evangelicalism, fundamentalism? That was what did for you, huh? That was the last straw.
I think so. I think I only realized afterwards. I tried to go to church afterwards, but I just realized that the songs, the teaching, the Bible readings, the incongruence, I just realized that was it. But, afterwards. And of course, that's when I started thinking a lot about other people and the reconstruction of identity, and started thinking about this with the clients that I work with, because it was very tricky for me because I was so kind of well regarded in the church, and I kind of had an accreditation as a Christian counsellor. I mean, I'm a clinical social worker, an accredited mental health psychotherapist. I was seeing lots of people from church background, and, to kind of I started to hear really quite anew other people's stories of, as you say, cognitive dissonance, despair, depression, anxiety, mental health disorders, which really were related to the cultural soup that they were kind of imbibing. They didn't have an intrapsychic problem. This started a whole other journey for me.
We had a guest on the podcast. Her name's Karen Garst. She calls herself the Faithless Feminist, and she's written a couple of books interviewing multiple women who have come out of religion. And her latest book is called Women v. Religion. And one of the chapters is by a therapist who, like you, counsels a lot of people who have come out of not just Christianity, but what she calls Abrahamic religions, Islam and Judaism as well. And she said,
indeed,
after years of counseling people that have come out of these controlling religions, she's compiled basically a laundry list. She sees the same types of symptoms in her clients. And she wrote a chapter about, I see trauma and I see PTSD and I see this, and it's become like a litany of the same things that she hears from all of her clients, because it's this, like you say, this toxic soup, this fundamentalism, religious control, whatever you want to call it. It has an amazing amount of psychological, sexual, emotional damage to people, doesn't it?
I think that's astounding. It sounds like a book that I want to read. Who did you say was the author?
Her name's Karen Garst, Garst, and she's on Twitter as well.
It does sound amazing. I'm kind of reminded of Karen Armstrong, who's actually more of a historian, who's written about, kind of fundamentalism, the Abrahamic religions, kind of from a more historical context. But I think people who are writing, and particularly women who are writing about the effects on women, are very powerful voices, and these are new voices.
Yes, absolutely, it's true.
What's happened in this city as well is that a couple of very significant, well-regarded journalists started researching domestic violence or family violence within various religious groups, Christian fundamentalism being one of them. And you won't be surprised to know that issues of psychological control, emotional abuse of women that occur in some of these Christian marriages and are kind of justified by biblical teaching is quite a scourge, and surprised lots of people by the stories, the number of women who flooded these journalists' kind of inboxes with stories, even ministers or pastors' wives who were subject to significant abuse. So we not only have the trauma, the post-traumatic stress disorder, the anxiety, the depression, we have the effects of actual family violence.
Physical
on
violence,
women.
emotional violence.
There are some church people who will acknowledge this and deal with this a little bit like the tragedy of child sexual abuse that has been uncovered in so many churches throughout the world.
Oh yeah, certainly
And
the
there
Catholic
are some
Church.
who will acknowledge it. But there are others who will deny, who will obfuscate, who will blame the women for these stories. I mean, that goes on.
We're seeing this right now because there's been that, I'm sure you've come across it, that grand jury's report of the Catholic Church in the state of Pennsylvania that listed hundreds of cases of pedophile priests abusing young boys and girls. And we're seeing the obfuscation already. People are blaming it on homosexuality. They're saying, well, it's because these priests are suppressed and closeted gays and all this.
I know.
So
This
it's unbelievable.
is such an old and tired argument.
Exactly.
And it is just yet another way of deflecting responsibility. We've had our own royal commission into institutional responses to child abuse within this country, which has been extraordinary because it's not just what's happened, but how institutions have covered it up. It's just blown the lid off the most vile practices. I mean, we've had in Adelaide in Australia, first time in the world, I believe, we've had a Catholic priest who's actually been convicted by a court of covering up historical child sexual abuse and is now serving a sentence for it.
That is amazing. We know for sure it's happening all over the world.
It is amazing. And, it's controversial because a lot of people want him to have a custodial sentence. Archbishop Philip Wilson, he's finally resigned under pressure and he's serving his sentence in sort of a home detention circumstance. But again, these are very hard-won games that have been made by those who for many, many decades have spoken about abuse within the church. And now we're talking about abuse of women, most specifically. Yes, children, but also adult women.
It's true, isn't it? And I hear this a lot as well from ex-evangelicals. In fact, I just started a thread on Twitter the other day and just kind of asking people, what were your experiences? Did you grow up in a home like I did where my parents practiced spanking? And that's led to a whole huge amount of very fascinating, if not horrific, responses from people about their stories and the abuse. It's just unbelievable. Children, like you say, young kids, young women and young men. It's just, and this is all again in the context of raising godly children. This is how they justify it. So yeah, we produce generations of kids.
This was a James Dobson thing. I think.
Oh yes.
This is kind of what was people's Bible, wasn't it?
Yeah, we had James Dobson, and then I was raised. My parents subscribed to another guy called Bill Gothard, who was very big in the United States in the 70s and 80s. And so he preached this whole thing, spare the rod and spoil the child. Foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod will drive it far from him. And this is how you train a child to avoid sinning. And that's what the godly role of parents is. And so this has led to a huge amount of trauma and PTSD and issues with sexuality and sexual dysfunction, and on it goes. And this is all somehow justified by the Bible and by the church. And so once again, we're right back in this loop, aren't we?
I guess I am grateful that I didn't have parents like that.
You were lucky.
I do have my kind of Jewish roots, of which I feel much more connected with these days. My parents are still alive, very elderly. My mother particularly, very benign, and with what you would call that kind of private but real faith in the divine. Certainly not fencing judgment on other people's points of view or saying what their heavenly destination or hellish destination will be.
Exactly. Hellish.
So I'm glad I didn't at least suffer those beatings from those evangelical parents.
I was going to say, we didn't finish your backstory because where you left it, you said your sister had unfortunately passed away. And then that was sort of the last straw for you, but you were a pretty big name, I guess you said, in certain Christian evangelical circles. So what happened when you walked away? Did you get a lot of pushback? What was the end result of getting out of it?
It's very interesting, isn't it? Because when I, kind of was talking to people for my book, in some ways you expect pushback, but what is more common, and it was my experience, and certainly people in my book spoke about it, is that it's more the deafening silence. That once you actually start that exit, and there is some research that supports this as well, that once you start to withdraw from church, they just withdraw from you.
That's true.
I mean, various truisms and platitudes are spoken about. They're going to pray for you. Let's keep up. Let's have a coffee. But, in reality, what that means is goodbye and farewell.
Have a nice life.
I don't actually want to talk to you because your views are threatening. They raise people's anxiety. They trigger people's doubt. So, I know that in certain circles I am spoken of as that backsliding Christian. Don't read her book. Don't do that. Don't waste any time. Don't talk to her. So it's more the freezing out. The people who actually want to engage with you in a respectful way are few and far between. They'll badmouth you, but they'll withdraw from you. But people who actually want to be your friend, they drift off. I don't know if that's other people's experience, but certainly from my own research and my experience, that seems to be quite common.
It's true. That's what's happened to us when we walked away from the church, 10 or 11 years ago. We heard exactly those same platitudes that you just said. Let's get together. Yeah. Let's have a coffee. Let's talk about it. I want to keep in touch with you. It wasn't like we stood up one Sunday and made some official announcement and said, now listen, people, we've been here for 6 or 7 years and we've been a real vital part of this church, but, we don't believe this stuff anymore. So we're going to walk away. So, we just quit going. And a couple people came around and they said, hey, haven't seen you in church for a while. What's going on? And our attitude was sort of like, well, you really I don't think you want to know the answer to that. But all of our friends have slowly drifted away.
And you can kind of see the look on people's face. It's a kind of a sympathy, a fear, an anxiety that you actually might talk to them. And when you actually have taught apologetics and trained people in it your whole life, it's no good giving that back to me or to you, I imagine.
Yes, it's
true. So
when
people start giving me apologetics, I can push back on that level, but I say that is actually not what I'm talking about. I don't want to have those kinds of discussions. It's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about church structures. We're talking about ways of relating to people. We're talking about gross abuses of power. And I'm not going to have those discussions about the historicity of various passages of the Bible and who moved the stone, and so it goes.
I've had a couple of guys recently on Twitter, and they seem to be, they're not super nasty trolls, but I post a lot of things about my experiences in evangelicalism and, like you say, some of the traumatic experiences. I was talking about spanking the other day on Twitter, and we got a couple of guys who always seem to think that it's their responsibility, like you say, to convince me that I'm wrong and that the church is actually okay. And there's a lot of whataboutism that goes on and arguing over scriptural verses. And my response is exactly what you just said. I go back to these guys and I say, you're not even listening to what I'm talking about. You just want to argue apologetics and biblical interpretation and this and that, but you're not listening to what I'm actually saying. I'm describing my lived experiences, the trauma that I personally experienced.
Absolutely.
And you're totally invalidating that. You're just wanting to prove me wrong on some biblical authoritative level.
Well,
you're not listening.
If they actually engage, if people engage with you on this and say, look, I feel like that too, going back to this idea that often people have a double life, or at least some kind of subversive story going on, if they engage with you on that level, it's terrifying. Both you and I know what's at stake. Your whole community, your sense of who you are in the world, sometimes your marriage. And of course, I interviewed people for the book who had moved away, but their partner hadn't. And it's kind of easier to stay silent and not speak. And I think that when people, I guess, take the initiative to be in touch with us, ones who have left or are leaving, I'm kind of happy that at least some people make an effort, because my experience is the vast majority do not. I'm frozen out. But if we do want to have an honest conversation, yes, they're very anxious. They're very anxious.
It's very disconcerting.
What's happening in them and what's at risk and what's at stake.
Well, and as I've said many times before, for so many Christians, their faith is like a house of cards, whereby if you remove one card, they think the entire edifice is going to come crashing down. So they can't entertain doubt. So like you say, someone like you or I is a huge existential threat to their whole worldview, to their whole theological system, because the stakes are simply it's all or nothing. I think a lot of people see me as a, not just as a threat, but as kind of a traitor. Like you, I was a pastor. I was a teacher at a Bible college. I spent 20 years in academic education or ministry. I've devoted my whole adult life to the church, and this now I've turned against it. So now I'm a traitor. I'm a threat. And I'm a little bit dangerous, and people are saying, yeah, well, I'm not sure if we want him around because I've got family members who are still very much into it.
Somebody said to me, I mean, here am I, a very law-abiding person, an ethical practitioner, a mother and grandmother. Somebody said to me that I was described as an antichrist. I mean, how absurd is that?
Unbelievable.
And that's the kind of nonsense that can be perpetuated. I mean, I remember myself when I was kind of right in the bosom of the church, as it were, that when these moments would happen, I would go searching for reassurances that, what I believed was okay and what my community was doing was okay. And you would think, well, I don't understand it, but these pastors, these leaders, they seem to accept it, so I guess I should. I mean, there were all kinds of ways of shoring up a faith or a set of beliefs or even a sense of self that was kind of falling apart at the seams. And I remember doing that myself.
Oh, I did too.
And it's only when you kind of think this lacks integrity, really, that the change starts to occur. Maybe that's with youth and with aging and with the wisdom of recognizing that integrity is more important than shoring up something that is ultimately unethical and cruel.
I think that is a fantastic way to end this episode, the first half of my conversation with Australian Dr. Josie McSkimming. What a great way to put it, that personal integrity is more important than shoring up a system that, as she says, is not only unethical, but it's cruel. And she's referring to evangelicalism and fundamentalism. And what better person to know about such a thing than Josie, because the research that she's done for her book about leaving fundamentalism and restoring a sense of identity, this is what this is all about. And I'm interested to hear, too, what she's going to say next week when we get more into the topic of her book and some of the research that she's done, interviewing people who have come out of fundamentalism, who have come out of these controlling religions. And again, we have to be very clear, this is not just limited to evangelical Christianity. We see the same hallmarks, as I've said many times, in those Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. In so many ways, they are virtually indistinguishable when you start to look at the fundamentalist aspect of it. You take a patriarchal religion with a patriarchal God, and you have a holy, inspired, and inerrant authoritative text, whether that be the Quran, the Bible, or the Torah, and then you start having all sorts of abuses that happen within the system, and you see this. And in fact, this is something else that Karen Garst, the faithless feminist, something that she and I talked about last year in her book, Women v. Religion. She interviewed women that came out of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and the stories are strikingly similar in terms of the abuse that these women suffered. So this is something that Josie and I are going to get into in more detail next week. So you have that to look forward to. And don't forget, the following week after we finish the 2 conversations with Dr. Josie, I'm going to be bringing you a conversation with my sister Valerie, a 1-year update. And then following that, we're going to get into the live podcast that we did in Seattle in September with myself, Stacey Ray, and a live audience of ex-evangelicals, some of whom came all the way down from Canada. These are all going to be fantastic episodes. I'm really looking forward to sharing those with you. Now, what's coming up over the next few weeks and months? Well, remember, we've got my sister Valerie coming up in a few weeks. Also, I had a fantastic conversation with author Sherry Palace. We're going to be getting into her topic of how man has ruined God and what that's all about. And her story is just an amazing, unbelievable one. And after that, I'm going to be bringing you a conversation that I had with Cephas Davis from the Pilgrims and Prodigals podcast. So there's really a lot of good stuff headed your way. Also, remember, before I let you go, that for supporters of Mindshift Podcast on Patreon, not only do you get access to great bonus material that's not available anywhere else, It's also a chance to hear these episodes a couple of days early before they drop on Friday. I usually release them on Wednesday, so you can have access to these episodes a couple of days before they drop on iTunes and Podbean. So thanks for listening in. Part 1 with me and Dr. Josie McSkimming, as we talked about how Christians are busily earning themselves a black belt in cognitive dissonance. We are going to get into that and even more in next week's episode with Dr. Josie McSkimming from Australia. So I will catch you right here next Friday on Mindshift Podcast.